that we can have an open dialogue about this critical issue. But before we get into that, I want to give you a couple of notes with respect to the work that we're doing. This particular webinar is a part of our Save Our Daughters Night campaign. Our Save Our Daughters Night campaign is okay. There you go. Save Our Daughters Night campaign is May 8th. If you want more information on our Save Our Daughters Night campaign, please go to the website that you see on the screen. The campaign was developed to really begin to look at our nation's girls and particularly how they intersect with their fathers. We wanted to create an evening that allowed fathers to demonstrate their affection and their love for their daughters by engaging in activities that would increase the bond between them. And there are several other activities that we have throughout the month that I'm going to share with you. For those of you who are Blog Talk Radio folks, we have a series of shows each Monday night called Dialogue About Daughters. Tonight, we are happy to have Nisa Muhammad. She will be talking tonight about Is Prince Charming Dead? We're going to address the issue of girls and dating and their wedding or their marriage prospects. So it should be a very interesting conversation. Many of you know Nisa Muhammad. She is the co-founder of Black Marriage Day as well as the CEO of the Wedded Bliss Foundation. For our faith-based partners, we're having a prayer call on May 7th. The guest speakers for that call is Pastor Deborah Morton from the Greater Saint Stephen Full Gospel Church in New Orleans, Pastor Christina Staten in Colony, New York, Chris Bouchard, ESPN analyst and co-founder of King and Gospel Award-winning artist Fred Hammond. That is taking on the morning of May 7th. Here in Atlanta, Fathers Incorporated is engaging in our Daddy Daughter Dance. So for those of you who are in this area, we encourage you to come out on May 8th at 7 p.m. Those of you fathers and uncles and mentors and coaches who are playing the role of a mentor or father in a girl's life, we encourage you to come out on May the 8th for that event. So this conversation with respect to domestic violence is one that we grapple with here at Fathers Incorporated. And really, how do we have the discussion? That has been the conversation with us. And what we have found in the conversation that typically where we get caught up is in the actual conversation. So one of the things that we wanted to do with this particular brief, as you'll hear more as Dr. Boucher kind of talks about the contents of the brief itself, was really to be a facilitator of the conversation, specifically in the space of responsible fatherhood, but also in the space where that intersects with the domestic violence field. We've been doing this work here at Fathers Incorporated for 10 years, and I can very proudly say that the relationship between responsible fatherhood and domestic violence has improved greatly. However, we still have a ways to go. I think that there are solutions that we can develop together. There are ways to implement our programs so that we keep in mind that the ultimate goal in all of these conversations is to keep our families safe, to keep our children safe, to keep our mothers safe, to keep our fathers safe, to keep our men safe. That is a conversation that we believe is still the conversation that we have not had yet. And I hope that today we create a space that allows us to be able to begin this conversation. I want to introduce to you our lead researcher at Fathers Incorporated. She is Dr. Stacy Bouchette, and she is going to walk you through the brief and some of the highlights that we discussed within the brief. Dr. Bouchette?
Hi, thanks, Kenny. I'm not seeing the PowerPoint on my screen. I don't know if anyone else is experiencing that.
Not sure why it's shown.
Okay, as long as everyone else can see it. I have it in front of me. It's just not on the go-to screen. All right. Thanks again for the introduction. I'm really, really happy that Fathers Incorporated takes this topic so seriously, especially looking at domestic violence as a systemic problem that is embedded in broader societal systems and involves in, issues like gender and race and economic inequalities. So it's not an easy topic to talk about. Sometimes it's very painful, and even for people who work in the field, sometimes it's difficult. We did include some hotline numbers at the end of the PowerPoint in case anyone needs to talk further or process any emotions around their own personal history or trauma associated with violence. But back to the PowerPoint. Tensions have always existed between fatherhood and domestic violence programs for a number of reasons. The practical considerations are both types of programs have very limited funding. So when the pot is low and resources are scarce, things tend to get a little heated. Partnering hasn't always been easy. A lot of times locally, those types of programs aren't even aware of the other. The fact that we have now entered into a discussion about different types of partner domestic violence, which I go into in the brief. So if it's situational couple violence that gets reported in a fatherhood program, fatherhood practitioners have to make a decision about where they refer the man to another program, if the police need to be called, things like that. Men as victims has not gotten a lot of attention, and they don't have a lot of support as victims. Batterer intervention programs are horribly funded, but needed, so the demand outweighs the need. Some theoretical considerations that have been problematic are understanding that the domestic violence is gender-based. So it's looking at women because women are much more likely to be the victims. Men don't have to be 50% to deserve support, but intimate partner violence is really part of a larger gender-based violence problem in our society and international. Other problems are involving the criminal justice system. Many fatherhood programs are working with men that have no interest in re-entering that system, and the women that they're with, even if there is legitimate violence going on, often those women don't want their partners to go to prison. There are stereotypes between the fields that DV organizations only care about women and don't want to serve the entire family, and fatherhood organizations are often seen as not taking violence seriously enough. So with that being said, I wanted to, Fathers Incorporated registered and went to the National Conference on Health and Domestic Violence, which was in Washington, D.C. last week. And there were two really important things that I noticed. It was a fantastic conference, highly attended. I would say, and I'm guessing, that at least 90%, maybe more, of the attendees were women. So I was looking around and I was asking myself, where are men? This isn't just a women's issue. It may be a gender-based issue, but there aren't enough men. Why isn't a DV conference a priority for other types of organizations, particularly for organizations that are serving men? The other issue that I noted was during a panel, two panelists were showing pictures of what they called broken down neighborhoods in Cleveland and Baltimore. So as many of you might know, I'm a Baltimorean through and through. and they said that these were man-made broken neighborhoods and communities, and women were going to be the ones to fix them. So people started clapping, and I went up to one of the panelists later, and I said, why would you say that? And I said, why would women want to do it alone? Why would women have to do it alone? Men are 50% of the population. Most men aren't violent. Why isn't this something that we're trying to build consensus around? So there is real division in the field that needs to be addressed. Next slide. I'm just going to go through some basic tenets. This is an important conversation to have in your organization. Kenny and I can't tell you how many phone calls we had hashing things out, making, well, why do you feel this way? And, well, look at this and look at this. So you have to build consensus within your organization as a first step. And I'm really proud that we were able to accomplish that. And then we sat down and said, this is what we think. You're not going to agree on everything when you partner with a DV or a fatherhood or whatever agency, but let's have some basic tenets that we start with. One, that safety is paramount. So violence is never acceptable, ever. And not to retaliate, it doesn't matter who started it, violence is never acceptable. The other tenet is not all men are violent. And most men do not use violence against women. So just because you're a man, no DV partner should be making the assumption that all men are violent. Let's agree more. Next slide. While any family member can be a victim, as I said earlier, violence against women is epidemic. It's pandemic, really. And the consequences, on average, are worse for women than when women abuse men. Women are more likely to have to go get treatment at a hospital. They're more likely to be killed. And economically, they are more likely to be controlled and suffer economic consequences like losing their jobs and things like that than men who are abused. Violence and abuse are not the same thing. Violence is a behavior. Abuse is part of a demeaning pattern of control and intimidation, and violence can be one of those things that's used. Male violence is an epidemic. So while not all men are violent, men on average commit more crimes in every crime category, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity. But the effects of that violence are particularly devastating in poor and urban communities and with women of color. Providing intervention services and supports to batterers or perpetrators is also a service to victims. I cannot stress this enough. And I say this at every DV conference I attend. If you think just having a woman go to a shelter or get other housing, getting her away from the man that was victimizing her, if you think that's ending the pattern, you're doing a disservice to victims. Because even if that man stays away from her, he's definitely likely to get into another relationship and could potentially victimize even more people. So batter intervention programs, they're not being funded enough, and we need to, people are capable of change, batterers are capable of not being violent anymore, and we need to have that service. It's important for victims. Next slide. Let's agree even more. So basically, gender and violence-based norms have to be changed. And at the root of that is really looking at how men are socialized to be violent in this country. They're taught to be violent at a very young age, taught that it's acceptable. In some cultures, taught that that's a major definition of manhood. But in looking at changing those norms, I think we need to engage men as allies, but we also need to attend to the psychological needs of our boys and men. So we can't just say, expect them to not be violent, but not offer them a way to process trauma that they've experienced in their lives. Particularly, this applies to fatherhood programs, whose men that attend them are typically have not benefited from the privilege, or from male privilege. They're living in poverty usually. They're looking for jobs. They are facing major social barriers. So they need safe places too. And finally, men have a positive and vital role to play in helping to stop all types of violence. We can't do this alone. We shouldn't want to do it alone. We have to build the consensus around the severity and importance of this issue, and that means learning to work with men, learning to work with organizations that don't look like yours and that don't act like yours. And we, Fathers Incorporated, we've helped many programs do that. As many of you know, Kenny is the director for the National Responsible Fatherhood Clearinghouse, and as a team, that's one of the things that we do. We help different programs work out partnerships. And just to close up, fatherhood organizations, we think, are particularly suited to play a role because they have these connections in the communities where they are. The men that work there are trusted and valued, and many of them have been through programs themselves, so men can relate to them. These are really important people that could be championing efforts to end violence and to make communities safer. And they are not being looked at as a resource, and that has got to change. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our panelists. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read bios. We will post their bios with the webinar materials on the site. But first up is Juan Carlos Arian, and he will talk about his work and go through his presentation.
Thank you so much, Stacy, and good afternoon or morning wherever you are to everybody. It's a real privilege to be part of this panel and this presentation. The overlap of fatherhood and domestic violence has been the center of my work now for quite a few years, and I have known Stacy and Johnny and some other folks in the movement for quite a bit of time. So this is, for me, it's very hopeful to see that there is movement in this dialogue between the fields of responsible fatherhood and domestic violence. And I come from the domestic violence field. However, I was trained in a way in which I approached the issue from a male positive point of view ever since I started doing this work 24 years ago. So that's a little bit the perspective that I bring. Next slide, please. And Stacy already mentioned a lot of the tensions that there are between the two fields. I want, in the spirit of maybe lightness and oversimplification, sometimes I say that the central tension is that traditionally domestic violence organizations have wanted men out of the house when they are abusive, right? And the fatherhood programs have been trying to get the men back in the house. Obviously, that's a big simplification, but in some way, some of the stereotypes that Stacy talks about are still in that department. And we'll go a little deeper into this thing. Next slide. one of the things that interest me, yeah, you can, and you can, yeah, like one of the ways that I like to approach this issue that I think it's helpful so that we are all in the same page, even if we have some differences, is to start thinking about male socialization as well as women's socialization, because they go hand in hand, in a broader way, in a wider way. The illustration that you see there, usually when I, show it at a workshop, people laugh, because it seems comically absurd, and yet in some way for me it's such a good illustration of how a kind of traditional hegemonic idea of masculinity, which we have had for a long time, puts men in a box. And again, this is not, I want to emphasize this, in no way I want to be saying, pointing the finger at men and saying that men are bad and women are good, and I don't get into that stuff. I'm just more thinking about like how we are taught to be men, how boys are taught to be men, including myself. It's really has traditionally been very restrictive, right? And it's kind of a little bit of what Stacy was saying. If we could have a perspective in which we see that socialization, that education for our boys, not only teaches us to hurt other people, because when we are, from the moment that we are little, we are, even if we're in a marginalized community, we might be given more privilege than females. We are told that we are in control. We are told that we are not women, right? Like we insult boys by calling them girls. For me, that's incredibly tragic, right? To have that dichotomy. So from very early on, we get this message like, to be a real man, you have to be strong, you have to be in control, and so on. So for me, that's an education to basically hurt others. And as Stacey said, I don't believe that most men act on this education, if you will, at least not in the most extreme way. But the other side of the coin that I think it's important to recognize is that this education also teaches us to hurt ourselves as men, and to hurt other men for that matter. In fact, if you take into account all violence, I saw in one of the slides from Kenny that you put community and family violence or something like that. If we take all of that violence together, men in fact are victims of violence at higher rates than women overall. And of course the perpetrators are men too. It's not that women necessarily are doing it to men, although that can happen too. So from this perspective of what are we teaching our boys to grow up to be, if we see it from a point of view that we are teaching them to hurt others, men, women, children, nature, environment, but also ourselves. And there's many ways that can be illustrated, and I'll just go quickly through a few illustrations here. Next slide about this socialization. So we are, as I said before, taught to exercise control, coercion, and when it becomes extreme, it becomes abuse. Next one. We also, as men, are given permission to abandon our families, and this is, for me, two sides of the same coin. And in some way, it has to do with privilege, but it has to do also, in my opinion, with the inability to connect with a range of emotions. Because again, I think one of the most tragic things that we do to our boys is to teach them that they should not cry. When you ask anyone in almost any culture, finish this sentence, men don't or boys don't, almost universally they will say cry. I think that's an enormous tragedy in any society, as well as we're not supposed to feel fear, vulnerability, and so on. Sometimes when things get really hard, we just quit. Sometimes because we don't know how to navigate those difficult waters. Next one, please. Sometimes we are allowed to have extramarital affairs, to use sex workers from both genders, and to use porn. That's part of the education. Next one, please. To act recklessly, right? From whatever driving or in other manifestations. Again, that could be part of that toxic masculinity manifestation. Next one, please. We certainly are led to self-destruction if we really don't look at all of these issues, right? If we are not allowed to feel any human emotion except anger, some of us end up with the bottle of or drugs and so on, and that's the way that we self-destruct. Next one. We are taught very early on to shut emotionally. Certainly, I was taught to that, and that of course can lead to all kinds of mental health issues, including depression. And then on top of that, this socialization also teaches us that we shouldn't ask for help, that we shouldn't be vulnerable. So men, even though they might not suffer depression in higher rates than women, we do not look for help as readily as women. Next one. The statistics about suicide are, totally alarming in our country presently. And for, I think, every 10 completed suicides in the country, 8 or 9 are men. So I think that's a point that we need to explore. So my next one. So sometimes when I work, especially with young men, I show them that this mosaic, this countryside of pictures, and say, this thing that you have been taught as a boy, and I have been taught as a boy, this is where it leads. It's just not a happy life. One thing that I like to emphasize is that I work actually for many years with perpetrators of domestic violence, and I don't think I have met any men who use violence, coercion, control that are happy in their lives. I mean, this does not lead to happiness. Next one. It's actually the alternative, right? It's a relationship of respect, of love. And by the way, one of the things that I like to emphasize is that in my field, in the field of domestic violence, we don't often talk about love. Kenny did in his introduction, right? The love of the father to the daughters and so on. So that's something that we need to be talking more about: respect, love, and finally a balance or equality among partners. And again, I tell young people, this will not guarantee that you will have a happy life, but it increases the odds much more than the pictures that I showed you. Next one, please. So, Stacy, talk a little bit about which would be the points of common ground between father and domestic violence. So I agree with her, and I think most domestic violence people will agree, and hopefully all fatherhood people agree too, that no one deserves to live in domestic violence, regardless of gender. Next one. That most people now, and I know that in domestic violence that has been a little bit slow, but that positive father involvement, it's not only good, it's extraordinarily important for children. Sometimes where we get stuck in the definition of positive father involvement, because we know also that negative father involvement can be extremely detrimental for children, right? Finally, most men who use violence learn it from their fathers. So that's just one example of why it's so negative. Next one, please. I guess this presentation was done when I was also speaking with healthy marriage people, and yeah, healthy marriage is good for everyone. I myself have been with my wife for 30 years, and I'm all for that. And of course, everybody's well-being is important. Next one. So in closing, I just would like to talk quickly that I actually feel that the domestic violence field, and especially batter's intervention programs, and by the way, I'm starting to change that to battering intervention programs. I would like people to use battering intervention because it's intervening about the behavior, really, not about the person, as well as instead of saying batters, it's people who batter or men who batter. It's a men's program. What can they learn from responsible fatherhood and vice versa? So responsible fatherhood programs, and I think Stacy covers some of these things, could be a great ground for primary prevention education, right? Juliana will talk a little bit about the different levels of prevention, but that's a perfect place for primary prevention as well as secondary, which here I call early intervention, when maybe there's already some of the signs that things are going badly and they can be prevented. I actually believe that responsible fatherhood programs are in an extraordinary place to create motivation for men to change and sometimes to attend batter's intervention programs. I have seen that done in different settings. Certainly supporting survivors of childhood abuse and men who have witnessed violence in their household. Stacy, that this is a pandemic, and there's millions and millions of men as well as women, of course, who grew up in these kinds of households. And again, because of the socialization that we have, we are not necessarily encouraged to share our stories about that. So fatherhood programs could also be a place where there's a space for men to share the pain that they suffer when they were growing up. And then I think responsible fatherhood programs could partner with battering intervention programs to help fathers, to help men become better fathers and learn skills, because a lot of these men do not have very good skills. And my last slide, please. It's about the opposite, about how battering intervention programs, what can they do to work with and support or learn from, I would say, responsible fatherhood. One is the positive engagement of men. I think that's absolutely essential. We have a paradigm in this country that men have to be mandated to programs for abusive folks. And there's many examples from other countries where men go voluntarily to these programs to deal with their own abuse. It all has to do with how the issue is approached. If you have a big sign that says, batter's intervention, welcome batters, not many men will come, I guarantee. Fatherhood programs have been extraordinary about taking into consideration culture, right? Especially, as Stacey was saying, the realities of marginalized men who, when they are shown the willpower and control, do not identify with power and control from what, I believe the battering intervention programs have resisted really looking at cultural issues for different reasons, but they can gain a lot from that. Certainly holistic approaches about, as well as strength-based methodologies. There's fatherhood programs that you well know that support men to advance themselves, to get their GEDs, to get a trade, to get a job. We have research that shows that unemployment is a major factor for the most extreme cases of domestic violence, including feminicide or homicide. So why not bring, support for these men to reduce that risk? Certainly understanding the power of fatherhood, of course, that's what fatherhood programs are about, and all of you who are practitioners of fatherhood know that in many cases, fatherhood is magic, to tap into that love that men have, as well as the power of spirituality. And I know that fatherhood programs have been more willing to come from that perspective than battering intervention programs, although there are a couple of programs now in the U.S. that use spirituality and faith and religion as their basis. And, of course, the focus on the children, which in some way it's another point in common that we could have once we focus on the children. Maybe we can avoid bickering about all the differences and find an important commonality. So I will stop there.
Okay, thank you, Juan, for that presentation. We are going to continue to move forward. Our next presenter is Asia D. Smith. She is the Executive Director of Purple Rain. Asia?
Yes. Hi.
Okay, turn your
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, you got an echo, but we can
Okay.
hear you. You have us on
Is this a
speakerphone?
little better?
Are we on speakerphone?
No.
Okay.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Asia Smith, and I'm very happy to be on this call. I apologize for the echo. I actually hear it as well. So I'm going to just try to go through everything, and hopefully everyone will be able to hear me. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, there's a quote that I really like by Fannie Lou Hamer. It says, "Nobody is free until everybody is free." Historically, domestic violence has been viewed through such a narrow lens, causing it to be more of a gender-based issue, which limits the culturally specific services that are often needed in communities that are impacted by violence more, that have less resources. And unfortunately, it also vilifies men and it excludes men from access to adequate services, thus repeating the cycle of violence. Okay, next slide, please. But what we have to do is look at intimate partner violence as it impacts the African American community. Mainstream organizations, unfortunately, have a tendency to have a one-size-fits-all model, which unfortunately limits the resources and the availability to services that most victims of African American descent particularly will access. Next slide. While the impact of domestic violence crosses all social, economic, and racial lines, there are many barriers and concerns that are unique to communities of color. We have to highlight that Black women between the ages of 25 and 44 are 3.5 times more likely to be murdered than women of other races within the same age range. African American or Black women are at a far greater risk of experiencing the most egregious forms of domestic violence when we compare it to any other group. And so a report was done by the Violence Policy Center in Washington, D.C. They found that Black women are about 3 times more likely to die at the hands of a current or ex-partner than members of other racial backgrounds. And lastly, the same organization reports that 94% of the Black women killed knew their killers, more than half were killed by gunfire, and 64% knew their offenders as wives, ex-wives, or the girlfriends of their killers. Next slide, please. So nationwide research offers a multitude of reasons why African American women may be reluctant to seek or utilize domestic violence services. There are particular barriers that we look at here, especially in New Jersey, as it relates to oppression, meaning that oftentimes victims of color fear being stigmatized. You know, they fear the discrimination. We know that, for instance, people of color often have situations with law enforcement that limits our resources in going out to seek them. Then we have to look at the inaccessibility and irrelevancy of services. Again, mainstream organizations take more of a one-size-fits-all model, so they're not looking at our barriers in protecting our race and in protecting the impact of economic factors. But lastly, one thing that we have to look at, which goes into the next slide. Next slide, please.
Asia, if you can mute either your phone or your computer, they're both picking up your voice. That's where the echo is coming from.
Okay.
So mute one or the other.
Is that better?
Still picking them up.
Hello?
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, so one of the protective factors that many people don't look at, especially as it relates to victims of color, is that many victims of domestic violence want to remain in the relationship with their partner. African American women are 1.5 times less likely to call the police for assistance, because the reality is the victims are just simply looking for help in changing the violent and controlling behavior. And last but certainly not least, a batterer seeking counseling or has been mandated to a batterer's intervention program is one of the strongest predictors that a woman will return to her batterer. So next slide, please. This is why it is critically important that we begin to look at how we engage men and boys as our allies in the prevention of and eradication of domestic violence. Next slide. So one thing that we look at from our perspective here at Purple Rain is that the cornerstone of our work is from a behavioral perspective. We know that men are victims of domestic violence in far greater numbers than reported. And we also know that the manifestation of the current violence that typically happens in a man's relationships, the root cause is something that typically happens during childhood. So one of the things that we like to do is to work with men as it relates to healthy versus unhealthy relationships, dealing with conflict resolution, effective communication, how to manage the anger that may manifest itself. You know, most batterers intervention programs, we see many of the participants are there, they're angry, and they're not particularly excited about being there. So we just have to make that shift in how men look at relationships and how we can stop the cycle of violence from that perspective. Next slide, please. The next reason why it is incredibly critical for us to engage boys is that 63% of all boys ages 11 to 20 who commit murder kill the man who was abusing their mother. Boys who witness domestic violence are more likely to batter their female partners than boys raised in nonviolent homes. We know that this doesn't happen all the time, but in many cases, this is more likely to happen. The range of problems among children who witness parental violence include psychosomatic disorders, such as stuttering, anxiety, fear, sleep disruption, and school problems. Children 5 or older have a tendency to identify with the aggressor and lose respect for the victim. Next slide, please. So our work, specifically with young men, deals from the same perspective with working with men, and that we talk about all 4 of those components, but then we also look at it from a perspective of helping boys to be upstanders, as opposed to sitting back and doing nothing or acting out in a manner in which they perceive to be cool. We want boys to look at areas of bullying and how that impacts relationships and what they're doing in their community. But last but certainly not least, we also look at sexual assault awareness and prevention for boys, helping them to understand and to define exactly what sexual assault is and how to prevent and to keep themselves from becoming victims or even
being in a situation that they find themselves that could potentially become criminal.
Next slide, please. And so these services, we provide technical assistance, capacity building, training and staff development, workshops, supportive services, assessments and referrals for men and boys empowerment programs, batterers intervention programs. And like Juan mentioned earlier, we really need to change the terminology of that program because it has such stigmatizations on it. It limits the real services that could be provided. We also work with gang intervention programs, treatment programs, and you guys can see the rest of the places that we work with on the list. Next slide, please. And this last component that I'm extremely proud of, and it coincides with Fathers Incorporated Saving Our Daughters Night, is that we have to look at engaging men to work with women and girls organizations to shift how women and girls see men through our Daddy's Girls program. We know that women who grow up without fathers often struggle with feelings of low self-esteem and unworthiness. We know that the role of a father is to teach his daughter how to be in a non-sexual, intimate relationship with a man. And historically, women and girls are victims of gender-based violence, by male oppressors. So in the same manner that it takes a man to teach a boy the character of a man, to love, to respect, to be a provider, protect their family, it's also critically important that we have men to teach girls, to teach daughters how to be loved by a man. And so working with responsible fatherhood organizations, faith-based organizations, gives us the opportunity to allow other men to actively engage in the empowerment of women and girls. And so it's really important that we look at violence no longer from the lens of just the woman's issue, but actively engaging in strategies and in prevention. Next slide. That's all I have, and I'm sorry again for the echo.
That's okay. That was excellent, Asia.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Next up, we have Dr. Johnny Rice, a fellow Baltimorean. I have to give that shout out to him. He was going to give his presentation.
Good afternoon. I want to thank Fathers Incorporated for their steadfast commitment to fathers and families, and more specifically, really applaud their continued efforts to inform and educate society on the issue of domestic violence. I believe engaging men in the prevention of domestic violence as well as advocacy against domestic violence is very important. And I also believe that I speak on behalf of all the presenters when I say thank you for really providing this tremendous platform in which to further explore this issue. Over the past 18 years, I've had the opportunity to support family strengthening efforts in my role in government and the nonprofit sectors. And I've also been an active supporter of responsible fatherhood and anti-violence movement with a keen interest in engaging men and fathers in order to reduce violence against women and children. And so what I hope to briefly share is some of my practice-based experiences working with men, particularly young fathers of color, in a program setting. If we could go to the next slide, please. So before I discuss specific barriers, strategies, and opportunities in working with men and fathers from my direct service experience, I would like to ask participants to think about how they see this work. And I'm talking in reference to the work of engaging men and fathers in the context of domestic violence. Are you hopeful about this work? Or are you concerned about the potential risk that is inherent in exploring this work? Or it could be both. I ask this because I've come to learn that our personal and professional experiences often can, in many instances, inform our outlook and approach when considering how to engage fathers on this issue. From a personal perspective, I grew up as a child who witnessed domestic violence within my household, which is to say that I can relate to and understand the fear, the anxiety a child experiences in being exposed to such violence. As an adolescent, witnessing such abuse towards my mother was very painful. And as a teenager and young adult, I started to confront my father and challenge him on his behavior, which almost unfortunately led to more violence. But I'm happy to say I was also able to see my father become accountable for his past behavior in terms of his addiction to alcohol, his abuse towards my mother, and to observe a process of change that was very beneficial to our family. And so I saw him transition from a violent man to a nonviolent man and reconnect with our family in a healthy, meaningful way that I believe is very beneficial not only to myself but to my children. And so my journey moved me from hatred to hope to healing, and the aforementioned experiences really forms my lens for my early work in engaging families. Next slide, please. As a foster care worker in Baltimore City social services system, I had the opportunity to work with parents as well as their children who were separated due to abuse and neglect. Many of the parents I encountered had limited parenting skills and had a history of family violence which traced back to their own childhood, and this affected their ability to care for their children. In some cases, parental rights were terminated and the children were disconnected from their biological parents. Many of the parents before the court were at one time, in many instances, a part of that same child welfare system that their children were engaged in. Next slide, please. As a youth worker engaged in doing work at a secured residential treatment facility, I taught life skills to young men and women, basically teenagers, who were deemed AWOL risk, suicidal, homicidal, and had witnessed or directly experienced abuse and suffered trauma as a result. In many ways, these young people were a byproduct of their parents who themselves had them when they were very young and whose upbringing was also difficult. And in one way or the other, many of these young people and their parents were connected to the criminal justice or child welfare system. Next slide, please. I would later have an opportunity to work directly with offenders in a maximum facility prison in the state of Maryland as an addictions counselor. There I met with many young fathers in my moral problem solving and relapse prevention classes. These men, many who were proud fathers, but also fearful and had a sense of shame based on their incarceration, discussed their own childhood, witnessing domestic violence and community violence at a very early age, and they talked about the lack of having a father involved to assist them in navigating their passage into manhood. Many of these men shared emotional pain associated with being separated from their children as a result of this incarceration, and they also were fearful that their children were starting to experience some of the same hardships that they did as a young person. So in essence, my experience working with adolescents, teenagers, and parents across systems informed my practice-based work with fathers and exposed me early on not only to the barriers and challenges that fathers encounter, but also to the positive attributes and assets that were embedded within many of these dads, as well as their respective families. Many of them were hopeful. Many of them had unique skills and talents prior to being incarcerated for those that were arrested. Many of them had a vision for their family that was a positive vision, even if they did not have the pieces to be able to put it together themselves. So when I carried out my fatherhood work, I had developed an empathy for people, not only based on my own personal experiences, but that professional work, and a non-judgmental attitude in terms of not bringing any preconceived notions about individuals, their circumstances, who they are. I did not let that negatively influence the work that I would do with them. And so again, these experiences shape the lens in which I would start to do the fatherhood work. Next slide, please. This lens was really developed reflecting real experiences of disadvantaged African American men and families across the lifespan in communities throughout Baltimore City. Two common themes that consistently presented themselves in the work was that of limited or lack of father involvement and the challenge of navigating a myriad of barriers in a community that were inclusive of community violence and domestic violence and other forms of family violence. And so in working for 5 years at the Center for Urban Families in Baltimore, I was able to engage fathers as the director of the Men's Services Responsible Fatherhood Program. What's interesting is that in government later, I would really see some of the same barriers present themselves that I'm about to explore with you on a statewide level in the numerous father-focused programs that we had, be it the general state-funded programs or the Office of Family Assistance federally funded responsible fatherhood programs. The overlap of some of the same barriers was significant, but for this discussion today, I'm going to centrally focus on my work at the Center for Urban Families. Next slide, please. So during that period, there were barriers that would consist of limited parenting skills. Many dads really did not know how to be a good dad in a sense of changing a diaper. They did not know the different stages of child development in terms of their children. There was a lack of information and insight in terms of how they could support the mother during her pregnancy. Low educational attainment. We had many men who did not have their high school diploma and did not have the financial resources to access higher education. Health and mental health issues, as well as housing and substance abuse, in many instances were coupled together. And so we had to work with these gentlemen to try to find resources in places where they could go to get treatment, as well as housing support. One of the unique challenges, of course, was criminal histories, which could create a barrier to housing and other job opportunities. Fortunately, we were able to assist them in dealing with some of those employment challenges. And not having an employment history, having children, having multiple children from different mothers would often present a financial hardship and burden that could be very stressful to that dad, as well as family and community violence. And unfortunately, for some families, violence and abuse may have been the norm in the sense that they did not know or had never observed what a healthy relationship is. How do you negotiate conflict? Those were some skills that oftentimes were not a part of their family development throughout the years, which created challenges with these other areas as well. Next slide. And so while we recognize that those barriers that were highlighted are not causal factors for domestic violence, they are issues that can influence a man's behavior leading to violence and abuse. And so I don't want to discount the importance of understanding the effect that those barriers can have on men. And one of the things I did not mention, but there's also a culture in many instances that one does not ask for help because it can be perceived as being a weakness. And so that's also another barrier in dealing with men, in the sense of getting them to be comfortable to say, I need help. And so what made the Center for Urban Families in our work very special was that we had a staff of committed group of men from the community who could, one, relate to some of the barriers that our clients were experiencing and were able to successfully overcome them. And so we were able to model what transition looks like peer-to-peer and also through our staff. We were also, as a team, comfortable in our skin and at ease in working in the community. So we weren't afraid to go into communities that were deemed high crime areas and engaged men on the stoop, go into their homes to have a relationship with them, to give out our card, and to talk about the services that we would provide. And also we had crafted a philosophy that was really based on a sense of family. So a sense of family atmosphere was created so that everyone would feel that they had a place to belong. And also it was very helpful because it helped us to set up goals which focused on their personal and economic attainment so that their families could benefit. So how does this kind of fit into domestic violence? Well, through our intake and assessment process, we started to incorporate questions in terms of domestic violence as a part of our regular screening. The reality is that some men can lie during the intake and assessment, but we can later match that up, what they tell us in their peer support groups. If indeed they later say that there's an issue of domestic violence, we can go back to determine how they answered these questions during initial intake and assessment. So this basically is an opportunity to discuss the past history. If there was domestic violence in that history, how do they see themselves and how can they address their violence if they do self-report that they have been involved in a recent issue of domestic violence? Goal setting and planning. What are you trying to accomplish? How do you envision supporting your family emotionally and financially? And if you grew up in a violent home, what do you plan to do different so that you do not have to go down that same path? Community outreach and home visits. There was an opportunity for staff to observe the clients in action to see if they're using those skills, the conflict mediation skills in the family setting. And I think most importantly was peer support and curriculum group opportunities. The curriculum group was important because it had a section on domestic violence that we were able to develop with support of the House of Ruth Maryland so that we could work with men so they could understand that abuse just wasn't physical, but it was also verbal. It was also using money, financial, economic abuse. We were able to, in curriculum groups, expose men to information that they, in any other form or fashion, may have never received. And the peer support group was a great setting to assist in holding men accountable, particularly when they had views that were anti-women or they had views that were very negative in terms of the community and family formation. As Juan Carlos and others have mentioned, we also were able to, in our curriculum groups, talk about what is my responsibility to myself as a man? What is my responsibility to my family? What is my responsibility to my community? What type of values do I have? Are these values that promote violence? Are these values that denounce violence? We looked at culture and looked at it takes a village, how we work together to support families, and what are some of those aspects of culture that aren't supportive of anti-violence, and how do we work to eliminate those if they are part of our current life process. And also employment linkages, and I won't go into this, but I know that Juan Carlos has stated some data in terms of how important employment was to really not only self-esteem, but as a contributing factor in regards to examining those cases where domestic violence was most prevalent. And the last two, referral resources, we realized we could not do this work in isolation in terms of just not domestic violence, but all of those other resources that we needed, such as mental health, such as education. We sought out and cultivated relationships to develop partnerships with people who would respect our clients, but also understand the unique barriers and challenges that they presented. And lastly here, alumni services. We recognize that even if a father was able to goal set and work with us through the planning and able to achieve many of the goals that they had laid out in conjunction with our staff, they may slip and have some difficulties in terms of different life areas. And so alumni services just is an open door to keep them connected to resources, not just when they have problems, but also when they want to come and share and to move forward in a positive way. Next slide.
Johnny, you have 1 minute.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'll try to be quick here. There are a couple things I want to touch on. Responses to men and domestic violence. Traditionally, domestic violence has been viewed through a punitive lens in terms of engaging men, so arrest, incarceration, and this has been applied when the violence has already occurred. So while this is necessary and is very helpful and required in the movement, there's also the renewed interest of looking at how the community can play a role from a prevention perspective. Next slide, please. Here you'll just see some of the emerging models. I know in the literature that Ken and Stacy have put out on this topic, they also talk about the ecological model, where here we also have some other ways to engage not only female victims, but male victims as well who may be impacted. And this is important because all cases will not rise to the level of the criminal justice system. So fatherhood programs will engage those men that may not be within the justice net, but do have issues around domestic violence. Next slide, please. And so community outreach to high-risk groups, educational interventions, partnerships and collaborations, as well as media campaigns, these are all activities that the House of Ruth Maryland and the Center for Urban Families partnered in order to best engage fathers. Next slide, please. We recognized both programs that we were serving the same families, and as a result of our partnership and collaboration, our men in our fatherhood program were able to be referred to the House of Ruth Maryland for services. We were able to co-facilitate on our site with House of Ruth Maryland staff an education and awareness group on domestic violence. But we were also able to go over to the House of Ruth Maryland and do an orientation for our program so that while they're focused on men being accountable for their domestic violence behavior, we were able to deal with all of those other barriers that those men were dealing with. And also we were helpful in helping the House of Ruth reconsider their philosophy, so they moved from shaming men who use violence but holding them accountable in a more effective and positive way. And as a result of our collaboration and partnership, more men were able to stay at the House of Ruth and complete their programming when they received support from both of our respective agencies. Next slide, please. And so just some final thoughts, and this is something that has been echoed thus far. Responsible fatherhood programs are in a unique position to affect change in men. The men that come into our fatherhood programs who have access to the domestic violence referral resources as well as the education and awareness can then go back into their home and community and share this information and newfound knowledge with other men who may never walk through our doors. And they may also, as our last presenter talked about, get the courage and the skills to learn how to safely intervene on a community level when they see incidents of domestic violence taking place. Next slide. And so I just want to, again, thank you all for having the opportunity to share. I think that Responsible Fatherhood Program and domestic violence organizations should continue to collaborate. We should not work in silos, because at the end of the day, we are working for the betterment of families. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johnny Rice. That was excellent. It's painful to tell you you only have a minute left, because I wanted to keep
Not a problem.
I'm glad you did. So next up we have Dr. Juliana Carlson, who is an assistant professor at the School of Social Welfare at the University of Kansas, and she is going to do her presentation.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay. Next slide, please. So like Stacey mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at the School of Social Welfare. But before becoming an academic, I worked in the field of domestic violence for many years, both in Kansas City and Chicago, and then worked for even longer as a community organizer, both in Minneapolis and Kansas City, Kansas. And I say this to point out that from my perspective, I really come at this work from a community perspective, thinking about myself more as a macro practitioner, and I'm going to kind of bring that lens a little bit to our conversation today. I currently work with a group of researchers called the Global Research Project to Mobilize Men in Violence Prevention. And this little group of researchers focuses on understanding this really global movement to engage men and boys to end gender-based violence. And our focus has really been more on primary prevention, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, so which is really focusing on violence before it begins. So I'm going to kind of pick up where my esteemed webinar panelists have been sharing about practice. I'm going to help us think a little bit more broadly and think about some frameworks that we could use to talk about primary prevention. So next slide, please. So the first question I want us to think about is, what is our gender analysis to thinking about engaging men, and specifically fathers, to prevent domestic violence? And I'm going to talk about gender-based violence specifically. And I'm going to introduce a framework and talk about what it means to think about being gender transformative. And don't be scared, I'm not asking for people to become a car to a robot or anything, but I'll get to that in a minute. The second one is what organizations can do on a broader scale. So thinking about, a lot of us are trying to create really a societal shift, a structural shift in thinking about gender and thinking about violence and power. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about a comprehensive primary prevention approach called the spectrum of prevention. And the third one is, what strategies to engage men are most effective or promising, and do they vary depending on the characteristics of men being engaged? I've been really excited about people talking about the importance of culture and talking about the importance of understanding groups of men, communities of men and women together, and having that influence the way that we think about what engagement looks like. Next slide, please. So one of the things I want to sort of point out is that I'm sure is true for most of us, is that this work of thinking about engaging men and ending gender-based violence is really a part of larger social justice movements. We can talk about the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, that there are lots of movements both in the United States and really globally, anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, that these movements are really we can look at as being partner movements that we can draw strength from. Next slide, please. So I am using the term gender-based violence, and that really speaks to this framework that people are talking about in a more global context, that we're not just, that it's not helpful for us to just look at unique forms of violence, but really that we're talking about a structural understanding of violence against women. And you can see here, this is a United Nations, the Fund for Understanding Population. So it's a wide range of human rights violations that include sexual abuse of children, rape, domestic violence, sexual assault and harassment, the trafficking of women and girls, and several harmful traditional practices. So that's just giving you a quick definition of gender-based violence. Next slide, please. So the United Nations, which is really a progressive movement or progressive organization that's really moving this conversation of how do we engage boys and men in ending gender-based violence, thinks about gender-based violence from this framework of it being a human rights issue and also a gender equality issue. And the reason why these things I think are really important is because this does really focus on that it's both men and women that we need to hold up and consider when we're thinking about the impact of violence. And some people have talked about this, and it's definitely highlighted in the brief that we're all focusing on today, is that there are negative impacts related to masculinity. Juan Carlos has talked about this, Johnny has talked about this, Asia has talked about this. And that's something that we really need to consider as part of the conversation. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to kind of unpack a little bit about what does it mean to have a gender transformative approach to programs. For any data geeks in the room, this article that I reference here by Dworkin and her colleagues, Dworkin Dworkin is a scholar that has written a lot about engaging boys and men, both to end gender-based violence, but also HIV, which is really two issues that are very central in the countries in Africa, and specifically in the country of South Africa, where Sharon Dworkin does a lot of her work. So next slide, please. So when we're talking about gender transformative programs in the global context, this is a way of thinking about efforts to engage boys and men, and this is a quote that I'd like to read. And it's to seek transform gender relations through critical reflection and the questioning of individual attitudes, institutional practices, and broader social norms that create and reinforce gender inequalities and vulnerabilities. And I have those a couple of those phrases highlighted in different colors to really indicate that we're not just talking about changing people one individually, that we're really thinking about the structural context in which gender-based violence is occurring, so institutional practices and broader social norms. Next slide, please. So the kind of continuum that's being used in this global movement to engage boys and men in this primary prevention focus is really thinking about this continuum, and you can see gender exploitative on the left of the screen and gender transformative on the right. I do not have time due to our limited time to get into this more, but I've given you a couple of references, links to websites that you can look to sort of unpack this and think about where does your programming lie when you're thinking about engaging boys and men. Are you working towards that gender transformative place, or where are you kind of in this continuum? And Sharon Dworkin's work in looking at different programs to engage boys and men to end gender-based violence and HIV prevention talk about that gender transformative programs are more effective at creating long-term effective change. Next slide, please. If you can click through this slide, it has a couple of words in here. So why this approach matters is, like all of our other panelists have talked about, is because there is a deeply rooted systemic historic nature of violence against women and boys, but also in the constructions of masculinity, and to really be able to get at those core issues on every level of society that we need to be asking these good and hard questions. Next slide, please. So this is something people are thinking about, again, in this global context, is that while we're engaging men, and I think Johnny's example of the House of Ruth and the Center for Urban Families is a beautiful example of thinking about that these relationships need to be hand in hand, that domestic violence organizations and engaging men organizations and fatherhood organizations need to work together. And I bring up this issue about accountability because in all of the recent international conferences that I've been to around engaging boys and men, accountability is something that a lot of men are talking about the importance of, that they feel like that they want to be and need to be accountable to women's organizations and not just be doing this work independently, because they recognize the power of male privilege and wanting to make sure that they are doing work in tandem with women's organizations. Next slide, please. It's okay. Okay, we'll keep going. I just have a couple minutes. So I'm going to actually skip to the next slide. So Juan Carlos mentioned earlier that there are these 3 different levels of prevention that I just encourage people to think about. We often spend, especially in the United States, a lot of time on tertiary prevention. So battering intervention programs is an example of tertiary prevention. We spend a lot more money here. We at least have some programming that's available in this area. But primary prevention is really what I think what a lot of us want to think about focusing on, which is how do we have efforts that really help to prevent violence before it occurs. And that is thinking about things like social media campaigns, social norms marketing, even prior to thinking about bystander intervention programs, is really thinking about how do we talk together about what is going on with our violence culture and how do we think about preventing it. Next slide, please. And one more slide. I'm just mindful of time, so I want to keep going. So the spectrum of prevention is one framework that is also sometimes people talk about the socio-ecological perspective of thinking about that we can't achieve the goal of gender equality and safe communities by only focusing on one level of change. And so this is really a multi-level approach that we need to think about doing all of these things in tandem. And again, a lot of us do really important work in strengthening individual knowledge and skills, which is at the bottom part of the slide. But if we're really thinking about creating large-level systemic change, that it needs to be that we're working together on all of these different levels up to the place of influencing policy and legislation. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to give an example of maybe what that could look like and some of the amazing work that's being done. For example, in Africa, in Uganda is one example, but a really great program called SASA has this multi-level approach of both strengthening individual knowledge and skills, educating providers, and changing organizational practices. And you can see some of the examples of that. Next slide, please. So I think I'll skip to just the next one. So some of the research, next slide, please. So some of the research that the little team of researchers that I've done asked organizations that work to engage boys and men all across the globe. We asked them what did they think needed to take place, what strategies they thought needed to take place to really encourage and deepen men's engagement in ending gender-based violence and increasing gender equality for themselves and for the women around them, women and girls around them. And they talked about these four kind of big themes, is that we need to move beyond workshops, we need to be rooted in the community and be culturally relevant to the community, that we need to be hopeful about men and boys, and I just think that's so important and powerful, and we've heard that from our other panelists. And that not just focusing on violence, but that we need to start talking and focusing on relationships and power. Because, for example, like other people have mentioned, that boys that become men that have seen violence in their own homes, that they have their own experiences of trauma and pain that they also need to heal from and use in the healing of the community and society. Next slide, please. I think we'll skip this one. People can read this later if they want to. I want to get to my last slide. So I just want to highlight a couple of really great things that are going on globally. There's this great study that involved father and gender equity study that was done by the White Ribbon Campaign in Canada. And then the last one, Program P, a manual for engaging men in fatherhood, caregiving, and maternal and child health. These are some great links that I thought people could refer to after the webinar. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I had to rush through it, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Juliana. That was excellent. I'm sorry we were so tight on time, too.
It's okay.
I really appreciate the presentations of all of our panelists. This is excellent information. We have time for a few questions, and I just want to let participants know that we're going to be putting up a poll question or two, so please do answer them. We will consider the answers and report that back when we post about the webinar. So with that, are there any questions? Are you going to open up the mic, Kenny? Is that?
Hold on, I'm sorry, I was on mute myself. And so on your computer, at the level of the attendees, you'll see a little hand there. If you have a question, you can click on the hand, and I will be able to see you and will unmute you. We did, in the midst of the conversation, get a question from someone, Lynn Walsh, and I posed this question and maybe we can address it today. She said, I had to step away, but research indicates that when men are married, having made a commitment to their role in the relationship to their wife, there is less violence than with boyfriends and ex-husbands. It seems instilling this sense of commitment and sexual exclusiveness and fidelity encourages and promotes better male self-control during conflicts. Can anyone count on this? What could be done to encourage marriage?
So, first of all, is that accurate? Is that an accurate research finding? And is promoting marriage a good strategy? Do any of the panelists want to address that?
I, of course, want to Google that.
Yeah, something.
Yeah, that was
okay. Yeah, I'm not. I think that there's a couple things going on there. I think that could be the case, that marriage may be a protective factor, but I also think that married people are going to be less likely to report. As someone who is not in a legalized institution, I think it is, they're probably more likely to talk about it. But healthy marriage is certainly something we care about, and I think that focusing on changing gender norms is really important too when we're talking about marriage. So understanding that people can construct their power differentials within marriage and how that can be addressed, and how partners can negotiate different to how their relationship looks.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Johnny, and I would just also add to, and just also being cognizant that the couples that are married, as well as there's aspects of religion that have been used to kind of cover abuse. And so someone who there have been couples who have been married for a significant amount of time, and because of that marriage investment, it may make it more difficult for a victim to reach out for help. There's also intersections between marriage and religion where there may be the feeling that, not from a spiritual perspective, that they don't want to tear the family apart, and that leaving out of a marriage would actually do that. So in speaking of the context of marriages that exist in couples that have been in them for a long term, that doesn't mean that those couples are necessarily free of violence in certain instances.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I agree 100%. And I think that brings up the important point of engaging faith-based communities, and working with them to understand intimate partner violence, how important that is, so they can address it with their congregations.
Yeah, I think that, we have 1 minute left, and we're not going to be able to get to those questions. But if anyone has a question, please pose your question in the question portion of the box to your right, and we will send those questions to our panelists and make sure that the answers to those questions appear on our website. I also wanted to allow you to join us on April 20th, where we will continue this conversation via Twitter chat. And so we will be hosting a Twitter chat on April 20th from 2 to 3 p.m. Hashtag Real Men Love. For those of you who want to take some time in reading the brief and want to extend your conversation on this Twitter chat, please do so. Also, if you have any comments and would like us to address anything that wasn't addressed today, you can please email us at fathersincorporated@gmail.com. And I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists today and to our researcher, Dr. Dr. Bouchette. This was a wonderful conversation. I wish we had more time to really allow people to ask questions, and we don't want to take advantage of the precious time that you have contributed today for us on this webinar. This is nowhere near the end of this conversation for Fathers Incorporated. We will continue to do the work that we have begun and beginning to frame the conversation of domestic violence and violence in particular around our country, but particularly within our families. I think there's so much more for us to talk about, and there's so much further that we can go. I'll open it up for last comments, and then we'll close it down for the day.
Thanks so much for the work you do. We really appreciate it.
I want to thank all the panelists again. And I just wanted to quickly say, as a first step to organizations out there that really want to address this issue but never have done so in any type of formal prevention or intervention or at any level, what do you think is the first step that they could take?
Well, this is Juan Carlos. I think the first step is to get more information about the issue, inform themselves, and as we said earlier, start reaching out to people that have been doing this work for a while. I think at this point there are many practitioners or organizations that have been now for many years doing this kind of work. But to do this work in tandem, domestic violence and fatherhood programs, I think is essential, and to dialogue at the local level about that it's also essential. That would be my recommendation.
Great, thank you.
And I would just say lastly that collaboration and not working in silos is very important, and that during the collaboration process there may be tension, but as long as it's healthy tension and focused on the betterment of the families and community, it's worth the effort.
Right, definitely.
Hi, this is Asia. I would like to just echo the sentiments and just to also say begin with the conversation. Just start having it. I think today was excellent. I want to thank Fathers Incorporated, of course, and Dr. Bouchette for all the great work that you guys are doing, as well as the panelists for sharing such wonderful information. And I think if people would just take just initiatives such as this back to their communities, back to their organizations, and start to have the conversation. And as Dr. Johnny just said, from a healthy perspective, we can begin to have the paradigm shift that's going to be needed to end violence against women and girls.
Yeah. There is a question that was posed that I'd like to open up to the panel. We are over time, but most of our participants are still on the line. And so I think that this was a rich conversation. And these two questions are actually questions that I think would benefit many of them on the line, including us. The first question is from Philip White, and he says, what age would the panel suggest us to start working with boys to address the socialization of boys?
Now. I mean, I don't mean to sound, to sound facetious, but I don't think that it's never too early, especially because the images that are being depicted every day, children have more access to the internet. They have access to YouTube, and so they're sitting there with all this information that they're trying to process. And so I think that if we start now, just people tips how to be kind, how to be respectful, what bullying looks like, what verbal abuse does, and how that impacts a person. I think we should just start, having the conversation and developly, where your child is or where children are developmentally, and we just feed them along those lines.
Okay. And Dr. Carlson, this question is for you. And Timothy Pratcher asked, how can we make our program gender transformative while also meeting participants where they're at?
I think that's a great question. I think that at the heart of it, gender transformative approaches really are where people are at, because it's asking those difficult questions about who are we, where did we get our ideas about gender and about power and about strength and about hope? Where do we get those from? And it's also not blaming. It's not a blaming approach. It's an understanding approach, and it also is looking at how are those influences. How do we get those influences from media and from voices that we might not actually believe in? I think one of the things that's really powerful about a social norms approach, which a lot of people are really thinking about, is that sometimes we think other people, either in our gender or other genders, believe certain things, but really we don't hold on to them as much as we think, or other people don't have those beliefs as much as we think that they do. So maybe people aren't as sexist as we think other people are sexist, and this is part of the whole influence of we put messages out there, but do we really believe that in our hearts? And so having those conversations to ask those hard questions, I think is really life affirming, and it's real. So I am a social worker, so I believe in starting where people are at. So I think that is really important. And I think it's believing that people have these hard questions at the same time as having experiences that have been painful for them.
Right.
I would also add, there's a program that works with the coaching.
Yeah, coaching boys into men.
What they found is that meeting boys where they are, not being judgmental, not being overly authoritarian, that they were much more likely to open up and consider these difficult questions.
Yeah, so that the Coaching Boys into Men, which is the Futures Without Violence program.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what's really important about this is it's not a curriculum of saying this is what men or women or transgender people should be like. It's asking the question of how do we understand power? How do we understand gender? And inviting people into that conversation. So it's not a I know I know what you should think like, and it's like this. It's asking questions. And I think that by its very nature, the method or the process of having that kind of framework by its very method is honors people.
I do too. And it gives them a voice and a chance to develop their own narrative about what it means to be a man in our society.
One of the last questions I like to pose, and I know that this is always part of the conversation when we discuss violence in our country, and that is the impact of pop culture and the media. So much so to the extent that many will suggest that as a society we are somewhat desensitized to violence. From your perspective, how much of what we are experiencing in our families can be attributed to the images that we are bombarded with in our pop culture?
Well, this is Juan Carlos, and that's a complicated question, and one of whether of chicken and egg, right? What went first? Because violence has been around before television and before all of that, for sure. One thing I do want to address about that is that one of the roles that I think all men and women and fathers can play is the protective factor of being a loving parent. I mean, there's research now that shows that the number one protective factor against any kinds of violence, family violence, community violence, media violence, is having at least one loving person in your life that believes in you, that shows you that there's another way to relate to women and men and children and so on. So one of the things I like to emphasize is that that's one place, again, where the fatherhood programs could help men make a difference. because it only takes one person in a child's life. It doesn't have to be the father. It could be a coach, like Coaching Boys into Men, or it could be a teacher, or it could be someone else. So that's actually absolutely essential.
Yeah, this is.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I would say that the responsible fatherhood programs, even during my direct practice experience, were consistently working hard to counter that narrative that popular culture often presented, which was one that did not really promote healthy masculinity. And I think now that there are other organizations, not just fatherhood. There's a call to men in New York. Men Can Stop Rape in Washington, D.C., Men Against Violence in Atlanta, and others who are starting to really step up to the plate from a more public awareness perspective and challenge on a national and international level some of the negative messaging that's went out. I know I've met fathers who have been at different points of the continuum in which on one end of the continuum, popular culture was a great influence on their life, and on the other end, it really didn't have that much effect. So it can vary, but I do know that as organization and as men, we should stand up and speak against those things which are counter to family.
I would agree, and I would just add that there really isn't strong research on a direct causal relationship, like Juliana was saying. And what I actually went to a symposium on this over the weekend, and it was around the 50 Shades of Grey book and movies that depicts sexual assault. They're saying it's consensual, and some people are very upset about it. So what they're recommending is that instead of looking to censor things necessarily, or spend a lot of energy and resources to get, a song off the radio, use those as opportunities for discussion. So what does this mean? And, and be able to help people to think critically about it. I think that that's the most important thing to do.
Okay. One last question, and then we're going to let you guys go. But I think this is a critical question, and that is, many of the speakers discussed the detrimental effects of violence on children. What are some primary prevention strategies being implemented to reduce toxic stress amongst young children 0 to 5 who have witnessed domestic violence? Furthermore, what has been the most effective strategy? Anybody?
This is Johnny. Just so I'm clear, Ken. So this is in regards to the prevention of domestic violence within this age range. So these are individuals who have not been exposed, correct?
No, these are young children between 0 and 5 who have witnessed domestic violence. How are we addressing these young children? The toxic stress that they are dealing with as a result of witnessing domestic violence at such a young age.
Well, this is just, and I'm not a clinician or coming from a therapeutic perspective, but I do know that some of my colleagues and others who work in those areas do work and engage those children, be it through art therapy and other types of engagement strategies. I know that there are ways in which they work with not only the child but the family to provide a safe space and a way that the children have a voice to be able to communicate, be it verbally or through other methods, the experience that they have, and in a way that is not discounted.
And if I may add, again, this is Juan Carlos. There's actually a federal initiative of DOJ called Defending Childhood, where there's quite a bit of information about this issue. And again, going back to something I said before, looking at protective factors, it's looking like the number one protective factor for these children are a loving, stable adult in their lives, as well as other things like talent, particular talent in sports or in the arts, cultivate that. Spiritual and cultural protective factors. So I invite people to go to the website of Defending Childhood. A lot of good information there.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Stacy, last words?
Just thank you. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to contact us, and we'll try and get you the information.
Okay. Thank you so much. Take care and have a great day.
Yes, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.